There are parts of you that were never meant to stay hidden. What you call fear or lack of money is often the shadow asking to be seen. When the shadow is ignored, it controls. When it is understood, it transforms. A dialogue with your unconscious. Have you ever felt panic when your bank account dropped even though you had plenty saved? That sick feeling in your stomach when an unexpected bill arrives. That voice screaming you're gonna run out, you're gonna lose everything, you're gonna end up alone with nothing. And no matter how much you save, no matter how prepared you are, that fear never goes away. It just gets louder. Listen, because what I'm about to tell you will change how you see every time you've hoarded money you should have invested, every time you've panicked over normal expenses, every time you've lived like you're one step from disaster despite having resources. You are not paranoid. You are not broken. You are not bad with money. You are carrying the abandonment wound. And it's running your financial life through fear. This is episode 2 of the emotional wounds that control your money. Last episode we explored rejection, the wound that makes you undercharge and hide. Today we go deeper, into the wound that makes you hoard, panic, and create scarcity through the very fear of scarcity. Carl Jung would tell you this wound formed the moment you learned that resources could disappear, that people could leave, that safety was never guaranteed, and your unconscious decided the only protection was to hold on so tight that nothing could ever be taken away. Here's what makes this devastating. The abandonment wound doesn't feel like fear. Feels like wisdom, like being responsible, like planning for the worst. The voice that says save everything, spend nothing, trust no one, prepare for disaster. That voice sounds like prudence, like financial intelligence. But it's not intelligence. It's terror. Terror that if you let go of anything, you'll be left with nothing. Terror that you're always one loss away from being abandoned, alone, with no one to help you survive. Most people think hoarding money is about being frugal or cautious. But Jung understood something deeper. Hoarding is a trauma response, a desperate attempt to create safety in a world that once taught you that safety doesn't exist, that people leave, that resources vanish, that you cannot trust anything or anyone to be there when you need them. So you hold on. You accumulate. You refuse to spend even on things that would improve your life, because spending feels like giving away the only protection you have. Let me show you what this looks like. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, 41 years old, corporate lawyer. She made $180,000 a year, had $75,000 in savings, no debt, perfect credit. By every objective measure, she was financially secure. But Sarah lived in constant terror. Terror that it would all disappear, that she would lose everything, that she would end up alone, broke, abandoned with no one to help her. She checked her bank accounts 5 times a day, every day, sometimes more. When her balance dropped even a few $100s, panic would flood her system. She would cancel plans, stop spending, go into survival mode. Her friends stopped inviting her out because she always said no. Too expensive. Can't afford it. Need to save. They had no idea she had more savings than most of them combined. Sarah's apartment was falling apart. The heat barely worked. The ceiling in her bathroom was water damaged and needed repair. She wore the same worn clothes for years. She ate the cheapest food she could find. Not because she couldn't afford better, because spending money felt like bleeding out resources she might desperately need later. Every expense, no matter how necessary, triggered the same response. What if I need this money for an emergency? What if I lose my job? What if everything falls apart? Her therapist suggested she was being too cautious. Her financial advisor showed her that she could afford to live better. Her sister begged her to spend some money on herself, to enjoy what she'd worked for. Sarah heard all of it, agreed with all of it, and then went home and checked her accounts again, gripped by the same terror that she was one mistake away from losing everything. When she came to work with me, I didn't ask about her spending habits. I asked about her childhood. Tell me about a time when you felt abandoned. Sarah started to deflect. Normal childhood, middle-class family, nothing traumatic. But I waited, and eventually the memory surfaced. The memory she'd been running from for 33 years. Sarah was 8 years old. Her father was a salesman, charismatic, fun. When he was around, everything felt magical. But he was gone a lot. Business trips, late nights. Her mother was anxious, always worried about money, always checking the mail for bills. Sarah didn't understand why until the day it happened. She came home from school and her father's belongings were gone. He'd left. No warning. No explanation. Just gone. What Sarah learned later was that her father had been gambling. He'd lost their savings, emptied their accounts, left them with debt and disappeared to avoid the consequences. Sarah's mother had to work 3 jobs to keep them afloat. They lost their house, moved into a tiny apartment. There were months when they didn't know if they'd have enough for food. And through all of it, Sarah internalized one lesson. The people you depend on will leave. The resources you think are safe can vanish overnight. You are alone. And the only way to survive is to hold on to everything you can because no one will be there to help you. That 8-year-old girl's survival strategy became the 41-year-old woman's financial prison. Sarah wasn't hoarding because she didn't understand money. She was hoarding because her unconscious had learned that letting go of resources meant abandonment, meant poverty, meant being alone and helpless. Every dollar she saved was proof she wouldn't end up like her mother. Every expense she avoided was protection against her father's betrayal happening again. This is how the abandonment wound works. It takes an early experience of loss, of resources disappearing, of people leaving, and it creates a core belief. Safety is an illusion. Trust is dangerous. Letting go means losing everything. And then it builds your entire financial life around preventing that loss. You accumulate. You hoard. You panic at normal expenses. You refuse to invest in growth. You live like you're always on the edge of disaster, not because you are, but because you once were, and your unconscious cannot tell the difference between then and now. Jung understood that the unconscious doesn't update its beliefs based on new circumstances. Sarah was no longer an 8-year-old dependent on unreliable adults. She was a successful lawyer with substantial savings and earning power. But her wounded unconscious was still operating from the 8-year-old's terror, still convinced that resources could vanish, that people would leave, that she was one bad decision away from losing everything. And here's what makes this cruel. The abandonment wound doesn't just make you hoard. It makes you create the very abandonment you fear. Sarah's refusal to spend money on herself, on her relationships, on experiences, on connection, was slowly isolating her. Her friends stopped calling. Her family grew distant. She was becoming exactly what she feared most. Alone. Not because she lacked resources, but because her fear of losing resources was destroying her ability to connect with people. The breakthrough came when Sarah's apartment flooded. Water damage from the ceiling she'd refused to repair finally caused a major problem. She had to move out for repairs, had to spend money she'd been hoarding. And in that moment of forced spending, something shifted. She realized the disaster she'd been preparing for her whole life wasn't going to come from outside. It was already here. She was living it. She had created a life of poverty consciousness despite having wealth. She was alone despite having people who cared. She was abandoned not by others, but by herself, by her own refusal to live. We worked together for over a year. Sarah had to do something terrifying. She had to prove to her unconscious that spending money didn't lead to abandonment, that using her resources actually created more safety, not less. She started small. She fixed her apartment, bought clothes that fit, started saying yes to invitations. Each time, the panic would rise. The voice would scream, "You're wasting money. You'll regret this, you'll need this later." But she moved through it. The real transformation came when she took a vacation, something she'd never done in her adult life. She spent $3,000 on a trip to Italy. The abandonment wound went into full alarm. "You're being reckless. You're throwing away your safety. You'll come home to disaster." But Sarah went anyway, and what she found in Italy changed everything. Not beautiful sights or amazing food, but the realization that she had spent decades preparing for an emergency that was never coming while missing the life that was actually here. She returned different, started investing in herself, hired a personal trainer, went back to therapy, reconnected with friends. Her savings account balance dropped as she started actually living. And instead of the disaster her wound predicted, her life got better. Her relationships deepened. Her health improved. She was promoted at work because she finally had the energy and presence to excel instead of just survive. The money she spent on herself came back multiplied because she was finally functioning at her full capacity instead of in constant survival mode. Now let me take you deeper into the psychology of abandonment. Jung believed that the abandonment wound creates what he called an autonomous complex, a pattern in the unconscious with its own agenda, its own fears, its own protective strategies. The abandonment complex doesn't think. It doesn't reason. It operates on one principle. Resources can disappear. People can leave. You must hold on to everything or you'll be destroyed. This complex was adaptive when Sarah was 8. When resources actually were scarce. When the adults in her life actually were unreliable. When holding on tight actually meant survival. But the complex doesn't evolve. It doesn't update. It runs the same program at 41 that it ran at 8. Treating every expense like a threat. Every relationship like a potential abandonment. Every moment of security like a dangerous illusion. The abandonment complex speaks with your voice, but it's not you. When it says you can't afford this, it's not making a financial calculation. It's expressing terror. When it says save everything, it's not being prudent. It's trying to create certainty in a world it learned was fundamentally unsafe. When it says don't trust anyone, don't depend on anyone, don't let go of anything, it's running a program designed to protect an 8-year-old from poverty and abandonment. And here's what Jung understood that changes everything. You can't heal the abandonment wound by accumulating more. You can't save your way to feeling safe. Because the wound isn't about actual resources. It's about the meaning your unconscious attached to resources. In Sarah's case, money meant protection from abandonment. So no amount of money could ever be enough. Because the real fear wasn't poverty. It was being alone. And money can't fix that fear no matter how much you have. Jung taught that healing the abandonment wound requires separating the past from the present. Sarah's father leaving wasn't about her. It was about his addiction and his inability to face consequences. Her mother's financial struggle wasn't proof that the world is unsafe. It was the result of specific circumstances that no longer applied. Sarah wasn't 8. She wasn't dependent. She wasn't at risk of abandonment through poverty. But she was at risk of creating abandonment through fear. So how do you heal the abandonment wound? Let me give you 3 practices. First, identify your origin story of abandonment. When did you first learn that resources could disappear? That people could leave? That safety was temporary? For Sarah, it was her father leaving and the financial crisis that followed. For you, it might be different. Parent who was unreliable. A sudden loss of home or security. A time when you needed help and no one came. Whatever it was, make it conscious. See how that moment created the pattern you're still running. Second, notice when the abandonment wound activates. The next time you feel panic about spending money, pause. Ask yourself, am I actually in danger? Or is this the 8-year-old me afraid of being abandoned? Am I responding to real scarcity or to remembered scarcity? Most of the time, the fear is about the past, not the present. Your unconscious is treating a normal expense like a threat to your survival because it's replaying an old trauma. Third, practice strategic letting go. You don't have to spend recklessly, but you can intentionally spend on things that build your life. Invest in your health, in your relationships, in experiences that create connection. Each time you do, you're proving to your unconscious that letting go of resources doesn't lead to abandonment. It leads to life. You're training your nervous system to tolerate normal spending, to trust that you can use your resources and be okay. The abandonment wound is not your fault. You didn't choose to be abandoned. You didn't choose for that experience to teach you that safety is an illusion. You didn't choose for your unconscious to build a financial life around preventing loss. But you can choose to heal it. You can choose to see that the danger that created the wound no longer exists. You can choose to live from your current reality instead of your childhood fear. If this resonated, if you recognized yourself in Sarah's story, if you've been hoarding and panicking despite having resources, know you're not alone. The abandonment wound is one of the most common and most painful wounds around money. It keeps you in constant fear while trying to keep you safe. But you can heal it. You can learn that safety doesn't come from holding on. It comes from learning you can survive letting go. Tell me in the comments what moment taught you that resources could disappear or people could leave. What experience created your abandonment wound? Your honesty might help someone else see their pattern and begin healing. Subscribe because we have 3 more wounds to explore. Next episode, Betrayal. Why you don't trust anyone with your money and how that distrust keeps you stuck. Until then, remember this. Your hoarding isn't about being responsible. It's about being terrified. And that terror can heal. You just have to see it first.
If this resonated with you, subscribe to the Shadow Dialogue and hit that like button. Your transformation starts with one click. See you in the next video.